The room erupted in applause as my daughter handed her father-in-law a watch worth $40,000. I sat quietly in the corner, clutching the pack of $10 socks she had tossed my way moments earlier. They looked at me with that specific brand of pity reserved for the elderly and irrelevant. I smiled back. They had no idea that while they were celebrating their victory, I was already calculating exactly how much their arrogance was going to cost them. My name is Margaret Holloway, and at 56 years old, I have learned that silence is often the loudest sound in a room. I sat on the edge of a beige linen sofa that probably cost more than my first car, holding a pair of grey wool socks in my lap. They were scratchy against my fingertips. I could feel the plastic tag still attached to the cuff. The sticker price read $10.99. Across the patio, the sun was dipping below the manicured hedges of this perfect Midwestern suburb. The air smelled of expensive charcoal and grilled Wagyu beef. My son-in-law's parents, the Carters, stood in the center of a circle of admirers. Richard Carter was holding up his wrist, catching the last rays of the sun with a timepiece that I knew for a fact retailed for $40,000. It's just magnificent, Richard stammered, his voice thick with performative emotion. Daniel, Emily, you shouldn't have. My daughter, Emily, stood beside her husband. She looked pale. Her smile was tight, the kind of smile she used to wear when she had forgotten to do her homework, but wanted to please the teacher anyway. Daniel, on the other hand, looked like a king who had just secured his borders. He placed a hand on his father's shoulder, beaming. Nothing but the best for the man who built this family. Daniel announced loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Then the gaze of the room shifted. It was a subtle pivot, a collective lowering of energy as eyes turned toward me. I was the widow, the remaining parent, the extraneous variable in their perfect equation, and for Margaret, Daniel's mother, Judith, chirped, walking over with a glass of Chardonnay in her hand. She gestured loosely to the socks in my lap. We didn't want you to feel left out on Father's Day. Since, well, you have to be both now. The cruelty was wrapped in such sweetness that it almost tasted like sugar. Thank you, Judith, I said. My voice was steady. It is very thoughtful. We know how much you like to be practical, Judith added, tilting her head. At your age, comfort is king, isn't it? I looked down at the socks. 30 years. I spent 30 years working in corporate risk assessment. My job was not to be practical. My job was to look at a pristine set of financial records and spot the single, microscopic crack that would eventually bring the whole building down. I had retired early. Not because I was tired, but because I had made enough money to stop caring about board meetings. But to these people, to the Carters and their circle of country club friends, I was just Margaret. Poor, lonely Margaret. The woman who lived alone in a house that was too big for her. That was the other thing. The house. Earlier that afternoon, while Daniel was pouring drinks, he had cornered me near the sliding glass doors. It was casual, or at least he tried to make it look that way. You know, Margaret, he had said, swirling the ice in his glass. I was looking at the market trends. Your property value has peaked. If you ever think about, well, moving to something smaller, something with assisted living, maybe, you let me handle it? I can get you a great deal. I am fine where I am. Daniel? I had replied, Of course, of course. He had laughed, but his eyes didn't smile. Just Don't wait until it becomes a burden. We only want what is best for the family assets. I mean, for you. I sat there now, watching Emily applaud her father-in-law. She looked terrified. I looked at the $10 socks in my hand, and then at the $40,000 watch on Richard's wrist. The discrepancy wasn't just an insult, it was a data point. In my line of work, you look for anomalies. You look for the moment when people get sloppy because they think no one is watching. They thought I was a senile old woman, happy to just be invited. They thought my silence was submission. They thought the socks were all I was worth. I smoothed the fabric of my dress and took a sip of my iced tea. The ice had melted, leaving it watery and bland. I watched Daniel whisper something to his father, and they both glanced at me before laughing. I did not frown. I did not cry. I simply catalogued the moment. They had just shown me exactly who they were. And more importantly, they had shown me exactly what they thought of me. It was a critical tactical error. I decided then and there that I would not say a word. Not today. I would let them enjoy their champagne and their Swiss watches. I would let them believe they were the predators and I was the prey. I gripped the socks tighter. I would accept the gift. After all, I needed to keep my feet warm for the cold days that were coming for them. I watched my daughter, Emily Carter, move through the crowded living room. At 32 years old, she should have been in the prime of her life, vibrant and confident. Instead, she looked like a ghost haunting her own party. She was clearing plates while the caterers hired by Daniel but paid for. I suspected. From the joint account stood idly by the bar. Daniel Carter, her husband of 4 years, was holding court near the fireplace. The Carters prided themselves on their image. They were the kind of family that took professional portraits in matching white linen shirts on the beach every December. But images are static, reality is fluid and often much uglier. I watched Emily pause near Daniel to ask a question. He did not even turn his head. He simply held up a finger to silence her while he finished his story about his golf handicap. When he finally acknowledged her, his hand rested on the back of her neck. To an outsider, it looked affectionate. To me, it looked like a steer being guided into a pen. I wanted to know if we should bring out the coffee now, Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the laughter of Daniel's cousins. Not yet. You're always rushing things, Daniel said, his smile never reaching his eyes. Relax. God, you are so high-strung lately. I took a sip of my water, my eyes narrowing just a fraction. I saw the flinch. It was microscopic, but it was there. Emily was fading. The sharp-witted girl who had debated ethics in college was gone, replaced by this nervous, apologetic woman who walked on eggshells in her own home. She really does need to learn to let go, Judith murmured, appearing at my elbow again. Daniel has been trying to get her to sign over the management of the estate to him for months, just to take the load off her shoulders. She is fragile. My internal alarm screamed, estate management. Oh, I made my voice sound tremulous and old. Is Emily sick? No, just overwhelmed, Judith said, waving a manicured hand dismissively. We were talking about the lake house title the other day. It is so much paperwork for one person. Daniel thinks it would be safer if everything was consolidated. You know, for tax purposes. I stared at the bubbles in my glass. The lake house. My late husband had bought that house for Emily outright before he passed. It was in her name alone. It was her safety net. Flashbacks flooded my mind. I was back in a sterile conference room 20 years ago, standing in front of a team of junior auditors. Fraud is rarely a sudden explosion. I used to tell them, it is a slow erosion. You look for the isolation of the victim. You look for the partner who answers questions directed at the spouse. You look for the transfer of assets disguised as protection. I looked at Emily again. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, rubbing her temples. She looked trapped. Well, I said to Judith, keeping my tone airy and vacant, I suppose Daniel knows best about numbers. I never was very good with complicated things. Judith beamed, patting my arm with genuine condescension. Exactly. Margaret. Leave the heavy lifting to the men. I filed that statement away in the cold, steel drawer of my mind. Later, I walked past the study. The door was ajar, on the desk, buried under a stack of glossy magazines. I saw the corner of a blue legal folder. It was the deed to Emily's house. Next to it was a notary stamp. Daniel was not a notary. A chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning ran down my spine. They were not just emotionally abusing her. They were systematically stripping her of her independence. They were liquidating her identity, asset by asset. I wanted to march in there. I wanted to grab Emily by the shoulders and shake her until she saw the wolf sleeping in her bed. But I knew better. If I spoke now, Daniel would paint me as the jealous, senile mother-in-law. He would isolate Emily further. He would win. I walked back to the party and sat down, smoothing my skirt over my knees. I would not ask questions. I would not fight back. Not yet. I would watch. I would wait. And I would let them think they had already won, 3 days after the Father's Day incident. I drove my sedan over to Emily and Daniel's house. I carried a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil, the perfect prop for a mother-in-law who is just stopping by to help. It was a Tuesday morning. By all accounts, Daniel should have been at his firm, but his car was in the driveway. When I entered, the atmosphere was thick enough to choke on. Emily was sitting at the kitchen island, staring into a mug of black coffee. Daniel was pacing the living room, his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in a low, urgent tone. I just don't understand why the account is locked. Daniel, Emily said softly when he lowered the phone. I tried to buy groceries and the card was declined. I told you. It's a security hold. Daniel snapped, not even looking at her. You probably entered the wrong PIN too many times. You've been so forgetful lately. Remember when you lost your keys last week? Just let me handle the finances. You're clearly too stressed. I stood in the entryway, invisible to them. I recognized the tactic immediately. It is called gaslighting in modern psychology, but in the corporate world, we called it destabilization. You make the other party doubt their own competence, so they voluntarily hand over the reins. Mum, Emily said, noticing me. She looked relieved, but her eyes were red. I didn't know you were coming. Just dropping off dinner? I said, putting on my mask of benign senility. I thought I would use the powder room while I'm here. I did not go to the powder room. I walked softly down the hallway to the home office. The door was open a crack. I pushed it with one finger. The room was messy, which was unlike Daniel. Stacks of paper covered the mahogany desk. I moved quickly. 30 years of auditing meant I knew exactly where people hid the things they did not want seen. They never put them in the bottom drawer. They put them in the middle of a stack of mundane bills, assuming no one would look closely. I flipped through a pile of mail on the corner of the desk. Utility bill, golf magazine, credit card offer. Then, a thick envelope from a bank I did not recognize. It had been opened. Inside was a notice of a second mortgage application. Beneath that was something far more dangerous. It was a legal document, a general power of attorney. It was drafted to give Daniel Carter full, unrestricted authority over Emily's financial and legal decisions. The signature line for Emily was blank, but there were sticky notes flagging where she needed to sign. Just get her to sign it when she's tired. A handwritten note in the margin read. It was Daniel's handwriting. My hands did not shake. I pulled out my phone, an older model I had kept after my retirement, which everyone assumed I barely knew how to use. I switched the camera to silent mode. Click. The mortgage application. Click. The power of attorney. Click. A bank statement showing a transfer of $5,000 to an account named DC Holdings. Margaret, I spun around. Daniel was standing in the doorway. His face was shadowed, his posture rigid. I was looking for a tissue. I stammered, clutching my purse. My allergies are acting up. I thought there might be a box on the desk. Daniel stared at me for a long second. He was assessing the threat. He saw a grey-haired woman in a floral blouse holding a casserole dish. He relaxed. The bathroom is down the hall. Margaret, he said, his voice dripping with patronizing patience. Do you need me to show you? No, I can find it, I said, shuffling past him. Silly me. I get so turned around in big houses. I walked away, my heart rate steady at 60 beats per minute. He bought it. He thought I was just a confused old woman. I went through the motions of visiting for another 20 minutes. I drank tea. I listened to Daniel talk about his heavy workload. I watched Emily shrink smaller and smaller in her chair. When I finally got back to my car, I locked the doors and pulled out my phone to review the images I had captured. I zoomed in on the last document I had photographed, a sheet of paper that had been half buried under a laptop. It was a spreadsheet titled Future Liquidity Projections. There were columns for Emily's assets, the lake house, her savings, her stocks, and then, at the bottom, there was a row that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was labelled Margaret Holloway, Estate Acquisition, Target Date Winter. They were not just planning to bleed my daughter dry, they were waiting for me to die, or perhaps planning to help me along the way, so they could take everything I had built. I put the phone in my pocket and started the engine. They thought I was the prey. They had no idea they had just invited the hunter into their home. Over the next 3 weeks, I perfected the art of becoming invisible. I stopped asking about Emily's job. I stopped asking why Daniel was buying new golf clubs while Emily was wearing shoes with worn-out heels. I simply sat in my assigned corner, drank their lukewarm tea, and nodded whenever someone spoke to me. I became exactly what they wanted me to be, a harmless, slightly confused old woman whose world had shrunk to the size of her garden. Their guard did not just drop, it evaporated. We were at dinner at the Carter's house again. This time, Richard and Judith had invited a few of their business associates. The conversation turned to high-frequency trading and offshore tax shelters. I sat quietly, cutting my roast chicken into tiny, manageable pieces. It is all about velocity. Richard boomed, gesturing with a fork. You have to move the capital before the regulators even wake up to put their glasses on. The table laughed. Daniel leaned back, looking smug. Exactly. Most people they play it too safe. They hold on to cash like it is going to save them. He glanced at me, a smirk playing on his lips. No offense. Margaret, I know you love your savings bonds. Oh, I do, I said, keeping my voice light and airy. They feel safe. Judith patted my hand, a gesture that felt more like a pat on the head of a slow dog. It is sweet, really. Not everyone has the head for complex finance. Some people are just meant to be caretakers, old dogs, new tricks. Richard chuckled. You cannot explain the blockchain to a generation that still balances a checkbook by hand. I smiled at them. I took a sip of wine. They had no idea. 30 years ago, I was not just a manager. I was the lead architect for the internal control systems at Stratton Oakley, a multinational conglomerate that makes Richard's portfolio look like a child's piggy bank. I did not just balance checkbooks. I built the algorithms that flagged money laundering across 3 continents. I wrote the protocols that caught executives trying to siphon millions into shell companies. I knew that complex finance was just a fancy term for moving money where you hoped no one would look. While they laughed at my expense, I was working. Earlier that evening, while I was ostensibly looking for a coaster in the living room, I had found Daniel's tablet unlocked on the side table. It took me less than 30 seconds to access the shared family calendar and the synchronized email preview. I did not need to hack anything. Arrogance is the biggest security flaw in existence. He had left his password on a sticky note attached to the back of the case. I memorized the dates of 3 meetings with a company called North Lake LLC the next morning. I made a call. I did not call a favor. I called a professional contact. James was a forensic accountant I had trained 10 years ago. We did not do small talk. I need a public records pull on a North Lake LLC, I told him, registered in Delaware, operating out of the Midwest. Standard check, James asked. Deep dive. I replied. I want to know the signatories. 2 hours later, my secure email pinged. I sat in my study, the curtains drawn, staring at the screen. The document was a roadmap of betrayal. North Lake LLC was not a business. It was a shell, and the primary funding source was a series of transfers labeled consulting fees from an account solely in Emily's name, an account she likely did not know existed, funded by equity loans taken out against her own assets. I traced the lines on the screen with my finger. They were leveraging Emily's credit, her inheritance, and her property to fund a venture that listed Daniel and Richard as the sole beneficiaries. They were burning her future to fuel their present. My phone buzzed again. It was a notification I had set up on my own bank alerts, monitoring queries into my credit history. Someone from a boutique investment firm had just run a hard check on my social security number. I sat back in my chair. The pieces clicked together with the satisfying snap of a loaded weapon. They were already spending money they did not have, counting on the fact that they would soon control my estate alongside Emily's. I looked at the photograph of Emily on my desk, taken when she was 5 years old, smiling and missing a front tooth. They thought she was weak. They thought I was obsolete. I closed the laptop. The investigation was over. The conspiracy was confirmed. Now, it was time to introduce a new variable into their risk assessment model. The Sunday brunch was a tactical ambush disguised as a family meal. We were seated at the long oak table in Daniel's dining room, the surface cluttered with crystal glasses, smoked salmon, and a stack of legal documents that Daniel had casually placed next to the orange juice. It is just a consolidation, Daniel said, tapping the paper with a Mont Blanc pen. I spoke to the broker yesterday. If we move your portfolio under the umbrella trust by Monday, we save 3% on the capital gains tax. That is nearly $15,000. Emily looked at the papers. her hands gripping her napkin until her knuckles turned white. She looked small. I really think I should read it over first. Daniel, Emily said, her voice trembling. You know I promised myself I would be more involved this year. Involved? Richard let out a sharp, barking laugh from the head of the table. He sliced into a bagel with aggressive precision. Emily, darling. Involvement requires understanding. Daniel has an MBA. You have a degree in… what was it? Art history. Let the men handle the heavy lifting. Richard is right. Judith chimed in, smiling over the rim of her mimosa. Don't be difficult. Dear. It is unbecoming. I sat quietly on my side of the table, clutching the pair of grey wool socks they had given me on Father's Day. I had brought them with me, claiming my feet were terribly cold these days. It was a prop, a physical reminder of their disdain. Is this like when I signed up for the cable television? I asked suddenly, my voice pitching up into a confused warble. I reached out and patted the stack of deadly documents with a trembling hand. The man on the phone told me I would save money, but then I ended up paying for the sports channel for 2 years. I never could figure out how to turn it off. The table erupted in laughter. It was a mean, dismissive sound. Daniel shook his head, looking at his parents with a "can you believe this" expression. No. Margaret, Daniel said, speaking slowly as if to a child. This is not cable TV. This is high-level asset management. You don't need to worry your pretty little head about it. Oh, well, I said, fumbling with my oversized handbag that I had rudely placed right on the table. I just worry. Paperwork is so… slippery. I made my move. I reached for my water glass, my hand shaking violently. I knocked it over. Ice water flooded across the table, heading straight for Richard's silk tie. Oh my goodness, I cried out, standing up and knocking my chair back. Jesus Christ! Margaret Richard yelled, jumping up. Grab the napkins, Judith shrieked. Chaos ensued. Daniel lunged to save his phone. Richard was dabbing at his shirt. Emily was freezing in panic. In that 3-second window of absolute distraction, my shaking hand became steady as a surgeon's. I reached into the open mouth of my handbag. I pulled out a document I had prepared the night before, a dummy contract, identical in weight and font, but filled with gibberish legal jargon and void clauses, in one fluid motion. I slid the real power of attorney document into my bag and replaced it with the decoy. By the time Daniel turned back with a handful of paper towels, I was dabbing uselessly at a puddle of water, looking on the verge of tears. I am so clumsy. I wailed. I am so sorry. It's fine. Margaret, just sit down, Daniel snapped, his patience gone. He wiped the table around the document, not even looking at the text. He was too arrogant to check. He pushed the pen toward Emily. Just sign it. Let's get this over with before your mother destroys the rest of the house. Emily looked at me. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear and confusion. She saw me clutching my purse tight against my chest. I stopped my fake trembling for exactly 1 second. I looked her dead in the eye and gave a single, imperceptible nod. Trust me. Emily took a deep breath. She picked up the pen and signed the decoy document. There, Daniel said, snatching the paper away the moment the ink was dry. He didn't read it. He just slid it into his leather portfolio, convinced he now owned my daughter's life. Was that so hard? I suppose not, Emily whispered. The mood at the table lightened instantly. They had won. They had the signature. They were the victors. And I was just the wet, clumsy old woman who ruined brunch. Well, Judith said, checking her watch. I think we have celebrated enough. Margaret, do try to drive safely. Maybe stick to the slow lane. I stood up, hugging my purse. Inside, resting against the lining, was the original document, the smoking gun that proved their intent to defraud. I will, I said. I looked down at the table and picked up the cheap wool socks I had laid there. I almost forgot my gift. Yes. Take your socks. Daniel laughed, pouring himself more champagne. You're going to need them. Oh, I know, I said, my voice dropping an octave, losing its tremor. It is going to be a very cold winter. Daniel? I turned and walked out of the house. I did not stumble. I did not look back. I had the evidence. I had the socks. And for the first time in months, I had the upper hand. The swap was complete. The trap was set. Now, I just had to wait for them to walk into it. The silence in my study was absolute. I sat at my desk. The surface cleared of everything except a single encrypted hard drive and a printed timeline. It was Thursday morning. The sun was shining on the hydrangeas outside, but inside, I was preparing for war. I had spent the last 72 hours verifying every single piece of data. I had the bank transfers. I had the unauthorized credit checks. I had the original, unsigned power of attorney document that I had stolen from Daniel's table. And I had the digital logs proving he had attempted to execute trades using the decoy document I had swapped in its place. Technically, Daniel had already committed fraud. He just didn't know it yet, because the bank's system had flagged the transaction as an error due to the nonsense data I had inserted into the decoy contract. He thought it was a glitch. He was about to find out it was a guillotine. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Daniel. Family meeting tonight. 7 o'clock. My place. Mandatory attendance to finalize the estate transition. Do not be late. I stared at the screen. It was not an invitation. It was a summons. I arrived at their house at exactly 6:55. The driveway was full. A black sedan with tinted windows was parked next to Richard's luxury SUV. Inside, the mood was electric with arrogance. Richard Carter was standing by the fireplace, holding a crystal tumbler of scotch. He looked at me like a man who had just conquered a small nation. Margaret, he boomed as I entered. Right on time. Come in. Come in. We have news. I walked into the living room. Emily was sitting on the sofa, her hands folded in her lap. She looked thinner than she had last week. Her eyes were dull, fixed on a spot on the carpet. She did not even look up when I entered. We have just finished a conference call with Harrison, Richard said, gesturing to the man in the charcoal suit standing by the window. I recognized him. He was a corporate shark of a lawyer, known for burying opponents in paperwork until they suffocated. Harrison assures us that the glitches we experienced with the bank earlier this week will be resolved by tomorrow morning. We just need to re-verify a few signatures. The bank is being difficult, Daniel added, pacing the room. He looked agitated. His tie loosened. They are claiming the document was illegible. It's ridiculous administrative incompetence. Oh my, I said, clutching my purse. That sounds terribly stressful. It is, Daniel snapped. But it's handled. Once we get the new forms signed tonight, we bypass the automated system entirely. Harrison has a direct line to the regional manager. I looked at Harrison. He gave me a thin, dismissive smile. He saw an old woman in a cardigan. He did not see the former chief risk officer who used to fire men like him for lunch. "It is a foolproof plan," Harrison said, his voice smooth. "We structure the assets under the holding company, and by noon tomorrow, the transfer is irrevocable." They were so confident. They were discussing the dismantling of my daughter's life and my own estate right in front of us, assuming we were too stupid or too broken to understand. "Excuse me," I said softly. "I need to use the restroom." I walked down the hall, my steps soft on the hardwood. I went into the powder room and locked the door. I did not use the toilet. Instead, I pulled out my phone. I opened my email client. I had drafted the message 3 hours ago. The recipient was not a family member. It was the senior vice president of compliance at the very bank Daniel was trying to manipulate. We had served on a regulatory board together 5 years ago. Subject urgent, internal audit flag, Carter accounts, body C. Attached evidence of attempted wire fraud and unauthorized access involving accounts 8890 and 4421. Suspect is attempting to bypass standard protocols via direct executive override. Flag immediately. I attached the dossier. I pressed send. The little blue bar whooshed across the screen. Sent. I washed my hands, dried them carefully, and looked at myself in the mirror. My face was calm. My pulse was steady. When I walked back into the living room, the atmosphere had shifted slightly, though they did not know why yet. The air felt heavy, like the sudden drop in pressure before a tornado touches down. "Ready to sign?" Emily Daniel asked, thrusting a pen at her. Emily looked at me. Her lip trembled. I don't feel well." "Daniel?" she whispered. "Just sign the damn paper." "Emily," he shouted, losing his composure. "Don't shout at her," I said. My voice was low, but for the first time in months, it lacked the quaver of an old woman. It was the voice I used to use in boardrooms. The room went silent. Richard lowered his glass. Daniel turned to look at me, his brow furrowing. "What did you say?" Daniel asked. I walked over to Emily and placed a hand on her shoulder. She leaned into me, shivering. I said. I repeated, looking directly at the high-priced lawyer, "Do not shout at my daughter." They stared at me. They were waiting for me to apologize, to retreat into my confusion. But I stood still, outside, unseen by them. The digital wheels of a massive financial institution were grinding into motion. The freeze order would be hitting their accounts in less than 10 minutes. The storm had arrived, and they were the only ones who didn't bring an umbrella. "This is just standard boilerplate," Harrison said, sliding the heavy document across the mahogany coffee table. The paper made a dry, rasping sound against the wood. "It simply grants Daniel the ability to make decisions if Emily is incapacitated or unavailable." "She is sitting right here," I said. "It is a formality. Margaret." Daniel snapped. He was standing behind Emily's chair, his hands gripping the backrest so hard his knuckles were white. "We went over this. Stop dragging it out." Emily held the pen in her hand. It was trembling. She looked up at her husband, then at the lawyer, and finally at Richard, who was checking his watch with an air of bored irritation. "Just sign it, darling," Richard said, his voice dripping with false affection. "We have dinner reservations at 8:30. Let's not let this little drama ruin the evening." Emily lowered the pen to the paper. The tip hovered over the signature line. "Wait." The word left my mouth before I even realized I had decided to speak. It was not the wavering voice of an old woman. It was clear, hard, and absolutely devoid of warmth. Daniel rolled his eyes and let out a loud groan. "Oh my God, Mom, please, not now." I said, "Wait," I repeated. I stood up from my chair. I did not hunch my shoulders. I did not shuffle. I walked around the coffee table with the steady, predatory grace of a woman who spent 30 years eating executives for breakfast. I reached down and placed my hand flat on the document, covering the signature line. "What do you think you are doing?" Judith asked, her glass of wine pausing halfway to her mouth. "I am reading Clause 14, Section B," I said calmly. I looked at Harrison. The lawyer's eyes narrowed. He saw the change in me instantly. Professionals always recognize danger before amateurs do. "That is just the beneficiary designation," Harrison said, his tone shifting from dismissive to cautious. "It is standard legal language." "Is it?" I asked. I picked up the document. "Because according to this, the primary beneficiary of the trust is not Daniel Carter. It is a corporate entity listed as North Lake Limited Liability Company." The room went dead silent. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Daniel's face drained of color. He looked at Richard. Richard looked at the lawyer. That is just a holding company," Daniel stammered. "It is for tax purposes." "I told you that." "Interesting," I said. "Because according to the Delaware State Registry, North Lake was incorporated exactly 3 weeks ago, and the sole signatories are Daniel Carter and Richard Carter." I looked up, locking eyes with my son-in-law. "Emily is not listed anywhere on the charter. Not as an officer, not as a shareholder, not even as a silent partner." You went through my private files," Daniel hissed, stepping around the chair to face me. "That is illegal. I did no such thing," I replied, my voice cool and level. "Public records are public for a reason, Daniel. But here is the part I am confused about." I pointed to a string of numbers at the bottom of page 12. "This routing number," I said, tapping the paper. "It is supposed to be for the domestic escrow account, but this specific prefix, 099, is not used for domestic transfers. That is the routing code for an international wire transfer." I turned my gaze to Harrison. The lawyer was now sweating. He began to close his briefcase, his movements jerky and nervous. "I think there has been a drafting error," Harrison said quickly, reaching for the paper in my hand. "I need to take this back to the office and review the—" I pulled the document back, out of his reach. "No," I said. "I don't think it is an error. I think you are trying to route $300,000 of my daughter's equity into an offshore account in the Caymans, and you were hoping she was too tired, and I was too stupid, to notice." "Give me the paper. Margaret," Richard shouted, stepping forward. The charm was gone. His face was red and ugly. "I wouldn't do that," I said. I pulled my phone from my pocket and placed it on the table. The screen was glowing. "Because I have already emailed a copy of this draft, along with the incorporation papers for North Lake, to the fraud division of your bank." Daniel looked at the phone, then at me. The arrogance that had defined him for years fractured, revealing the terrified child beneath. You what?" he whispered. "You thought I was just an old woman buying socks," I said, a cold smile touching my lips. "You forgot that before I was a grandmother. I was the person who put men like you in prison." Emily stood up. She looked at her husband, then at the document in my hand. The confusion in her eyes was clearing, replaced by a dawning, horrific realization. The air in the room had shifted completely. They were no longer the hunters. They were the ones caught in the headlights. I did not stop with the email. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick manila folder, dropping it onto the glass table with a heavy thud. It slid across the surface and came to rest in front of Emily. "Open it," I said. Emily hesitated, her hand hovering over the cover. "Don't touch that," Emily Daniel screamed, lunging forward. Richard caught his son by the arm, holding him back. The older man was staring at the folder with a look of dawning horror. He knew exactly what was inside because he knew exactly what crimes they had committed. Emily opened the folder. Inside was a spreadsheet I had compiled over the last 10 days. It was color-coded. What is this?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. "That is a record of 22 separate wire transfers made from your joint savings account over the last 6 months. I explained, my voice steady and clinical. Each transfer was for $9,900. I looked at Harrison, the lawyer. He had backed away from the table and was now standing near the door, clutching his briefcase like a shield. "Mr. Harrison knows why that number is specific, don't you?" I asked. The lawyer said nothing. "He was looking for an exit. It is called structuring," I said, turning back to Daniel. "Or, in federal terms, smurfing. You keep the transfers under $10,000 to avoid triggering a currency transaction report. It is a felony. And since you used the internet to execute the trades, it is also wire fraud. You don't know what you're talking about." Daniel stammered. Sweat was running down his temples. "We were investing. We were building a future. You were laundering money to cover Richard's gambling debts," I said. The room froze. Richard's face turned a violent shade of purple. "How dare you?" Richard hissed. "I am a respected member of this community. I have friends in the mayor's office. I have leverage. You have nothing." I replied calmly, "I ran a background check on your so-called holding company. It is leveraged to the hilt. You have 3 liens against this house. You are not wealthy. Richard, you are broke. And you have been using my daughter's inheritance to keep up the appearance that you are not." Emily flipped through the pages. She saw the dates. She saw the amounts. She saw the transfers to casinos in Atlantic City and online betting platforms. Emily looked up. Her eyes were swimming with tears, but her voice was gaining strength. "You told me. You told me the market was down. You told me we had to cut back on groceries." "I was fixing it," Daniel pleaded, dropping to his knees beside her chair. He tried to grab her hand, but she pulled it away as if he were burning hot. Please. It was just a temporary cash flow problem. Dad had a system. We were going to win it back. We just needed access to the trust to double down. We would have paid you back. With interest," Judith cried out from the sofa, her voice shrill and desperate. "We would have paid it back with interest. Emily, we are family." I watched them unravel. It was pathetic. The veneer of high society had peeled away, revealing nothing but desperate, greedy addicts. "There is no system," I said. "There is only math. And the math says you have stolen nearly $80,000 from my daughter already. This document tonight was your attempt to steal the remaining $300,000. I can explain." Daniel sobbed. I just need time." "You are out of time," I said. I looked at Harrison. The lawyer was shaking his head. I was not aware of the structuring, Harrison said quickly, holding up his hands. I was hired to draft a standard power of attorney. I have no part in the financial management of this family. Then I suggest you leave before the police ask why your signature is on the witness line of a fraudulent document, I said. Harrison did not hesitate. He turned and walked out the front door without another word. The sound of the heavy door clicking shut echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. He left. Daniel whispered. Why did he leave? Because he knows a sinking ship when he sees one. I answered. I walked over to the window and looked out at the driveway. The sun had set, and the streetlights were flickering on. You thought I was feeble, I said, turning back to face the three of them. You thought I was a harmless widow who counted coupons and knitted socks. You forgot that I spent 30 years hunting people who thought they were smarter than the law. I pointed to the folder in Emily's lap. The evidence in that folder has been verified by a forensic accountant. The email I sent earlier went to the bank's fraud division, and the copy of the unauthorized mortgage application that is currently sitting in the inbox of the district attorney. Richard collapsed onto the sofa next to his wife. He looked old. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of reality. You called the district attorney, Judith whispered. I did, I said, because unlike you, I protect my family. Emily stood up. She held the folder against her chest. She looked at Daniel, who was still kneeling on the floor, weeping into his hands. She looked at his parents, who were staring at the wall in shock. Then she looked at me. Mom, she said. Her voice was steady. Let's go. No. Daniel screamed, grabbing at her skirt. You can't leave. You're my wife. Emily looked down at him. There was no love left in her eyes. There was only pity and disgust. I am not your wife, she said clearly. I am your victim. And I am done. She stepped around him. The air in the room was thick with the smell of expensive cologne and fear. The power had shifted completely. The empire of lies they had built was not just cracking, it had already turned to dust. I picked up my purse and the cheap wool socks they had given me, and I followed my daughter to the door. Margaret, please, let us be reasonable, Richard said, stepping between us and the heavy oak door. His voice had lost its boom. Now it was a wheedling, oily thing. He held his hands up, palms open, the universal gesture of a man trying to sell a lemon. We are family. You know how the courts are. Lawyers will eat up everything. If we go to trial, nobody wins. We can work out a payment plan. I can liquidate the vacation home. I can have the money back in Emily's account in 6 months. 6 months? I repeated, my voice flat. You don't have 6 months, Richard. You don't even have 6 minutes. Think of the scandal. Margaret, Judith pleaded, rushing forward to clutch at my sleeve. Her mascara was running, turning her into a tragic clown. Everyone in the club will know. It will ruin us. And think of poor Emily. Does she really want to be the woman who sent her own husband to prison? Think of the shame. I looked down at Judith's hand on my arm. I did not shake it off. I simply stared at it until she let go, retreating as if she had touched a hot stove. The shame is not hers to carry, I said. It is yours. Emily, baby, Daniel cried out. He looked wretched. His tie was hanging loose around his neck like a noose. I did it for us. I swear. I just wanted to be the man you deserved. I wanted to give you the world. You have to believe me. Just tell your mom to stop. Tell her we can fix this internally." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to my daughter. For years, this was the moment where she would have folded. She would have apologized for causing a scene. She would have accepted the lie to keep the peace. Emily looked at Daniel. She looked at the man she had promised to love and cherish. Then she looked at the spreadsheet in her hand, the cold, hard proof that he viewed her not as a partner, but as a resource to be mined. "You didn't do it for me," Emily said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not shake. "You did it because you are weak. You let your parents treat me like an ATM because you were too scared to stand on your own 2 feet. You are 35 years old, Daniel, and you are still a child." "That's not true," Daniel shouted, his face crumpling. I love you." "You don't love me," Emily replied, stepping back. "You love the way I make you feel safe while you steal from me." "Emily, be rational," Richard barked, losing his temper again. "If you walk out that door, you get nothing. We will fight you. We will drag this out for 10 years. "No, you won't," I interrupted. I walked over to the window and pulled back the heavy velvet curtain. "Look," I said. Outside, the street was no longer dark. It was bathed in the rhythmic, strobe light pulse of red and blue. 2 police cruisers were parked at the curb, blocking the driveway. A third car, an unmarked sedan belonging to the district attorney's office, pulled up behind them. "I didn't just email the bank," I said, turning back to the terrified trio. "I filed an emergency injunction, and since the amount stolen exceeds $50,000 across state lines via wire transfer, it is a federal jurisdiction matter. They are not here to talk. They are here to execute a warrant." Daniel fell back against the wall, sliding down until he hit the floor. He put his head between his knees. He was hyperventilating. This can't be happening," Daniel gasped. "It is happening," I said. "And it is happening because you made a choice. You chose greed over loyalty." I turned to Emily. The flashing lights outside cast harsh shadows across her face, making her look like a statue carved from marble. She looked strong. "The officers will need a statement," I told her softly. "You can tell them it was a misunderstanding. You can tell them we will handle it civilly, and they might walk away for tonight. Or you can tell them the truth." I stepped back, leaving the space open between her and the door. I had done the work. I had gathered the evidence. I had set the trap. But I could not spring it. That final action belonged to her. "It is your life, Emily," I said. "Do you want to go back to being their victim? Or do you want to be free?" The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. The only sound was Daniel's ragged breathing and the distant crackle of a police radio from the driveway. Richard and Judith stood frozen, their eyes locked on Emily, praying that their years of manipulation had left enough of a mark to save them one last time. Emily looked at the door. Then she looked at me. She took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, her shoulders squared. "Open the door, Mum," she said. "Let them in." The officers did not shout. They did not need to. They stepped into the foyer with the heavy, bureaucratic weight of the state behind them. I watched as the tall officer in the front handed Richard a warrant. The paper was crisp and white against Richard's trembling hands. The colour had drained from his face, leaving him looking like a wax figure left too near a fire. "This is a mistake," Richard croaked, his voice cracking. "I know the judge. I played golf with him last Sunday. Judge Miller signed this warrant. Sir, the officer replied, his tone bored and professional. He also recused himself from any future bail hearings regarding your case due to a conflict of interest. You have the right to remain silent. Judith collapsed onto the expensive Persian rug, sobbing into her hands. It was not a cry of remorse. It was the cry of a woman watching her social standing evaporate. By tomorrow morning, the news would be everywhere. The club memberships, the charity galas, the pristine reputation they had curated for 40 years, it was all gone. They were no longer the prestigious Carters, they were just common thieves in expensive clothes. Daniel was the quietest. He stood up as the second officer approached him. He looked at Emily, his eyes pleading for a salvation that was not coming. "Em," he whispered. "Please." Emily did not look away, but she did not step forward either. She stood beside me, her spine straight, her hands unclenched. For the first time in her marriage, she was not shrinking to fit into the small space they had allotted for her. She was taking up the whole room. "Call your lawyer." "Daniel?" Emily said. Her voice was cool, stripped of all the frantic anxiety that had plagued her for months. "You are going to need a good one." They led them out. The neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, their faces illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights. The humiliation was total. The privacy they cherished so much was shattered. I turned to the entryway table where I had left the small gift bag. I reached inside and pulled out the pair of grey wool socks. The $10 gift meant to remind me of my place. The gift meant to say I was old, irrelevant, and easily pacified. I walked over to Judith, who was still sitting on the floor while an officer waited for her to stand up. She looked up at me, her mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks. "You destroyed us," she hissed. "You are a monster. I am a mother." I corrected her. "And I am a professional. You just forgot to check my resume." I tucked the socks into my purse. They were no longer a symbol of their disrespect. They were a trophy of my victory. I would wear them. They looked warm, and I had a feeling I would sleep very well tonight. "Come on." "Mom," Emily said, opening the front door. The cool night air rushed in, smelling of rain and clean earth. It washed away the scent of stale cologne and lies. I paused at the threshold. The house was silent now. The grand furniture, the art on the walls, the crystal chandelier, it was all just evidence now. "You asked me once why I retired early," I said to the empty room, though I knew the officers could hear me. "I told you it was because I was tired. That was a lie. I retired because there was no challenge left. Thank you for making me feel useful again." We walked out past the police cars, past the staring neighbors, and toward my sedan. Emily got into the driver's seat. She adjusted the mirror, put the car in gear, and drove us away from the wreckage of her past life. She did not look back in the rearview mirror. Not even once. They had spent years building a fortress of manipulation, thinking they were untouchable kings and queens. But they made the classic mistake of the arrogant. They assumed the quiet woman in the corner was watching because she was confused. They never considered that she was watching because she was aiming. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you guys are tuning in from. Drop a comment down below with your city or country. And let me know what you would have done if you were in Margaret's shoes. If you enjoyed this takedown, please make sure to subscribe to the Nora Revenge Stories channel. Smash that like button and hit the hype button to help this story get heard by even more people.